While undoing some of the previous administration's policies might be as simple as President Biden signing executive orders, others will be more challenging, like rejoining the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. The president has said that if Tehran resumes strict compliance with the 2015 nuclear agreement, the U.S. would rejoin as a starting point for future negotiations. Tensions have grown between the two nations since Trump quit the deal in 2018. Benham Bentaleblu is here to discuss all of that with us. He is a senior fellow at the think tank Foundation for Defense of Democracies, focusing on Iranian security and political issues. And Benham, I always like having you here because you, in a very plain-spoken way, really explain the complicated issues happening in the Middle East, particularly with Iran. So let us start with the agreement. How realistic are President Biden's chances when it comes to rejoining the Iran nuclear deal? It's not like the Paris Climate Agreement where, you know, even though the U.S. had removed itself, it took like a year before it was officially out. This is a little different.
Well, good morning. Great to be with you. You set the bar kind of high there. I'll do my best. But in short, it is quite different from some of the other accords that the U.S. is already intent on returning to, like you mentioned, the Paris Climate Accord. Basically, you have a constellation of diplomacy skeptics in the top positions of the government of the Islamic Republic. Trust in the U.S. is at an all-time low. And lest we forget, Iran, too, has been habitually violating the deal starting a year after the U.S. actually left the deal. So not all the pieces of the puzzle are in place. Now, there is a political will on behalf of the Biden administration to rejoin the deal. You talked about compliance for compliance. That really begets a larger problem, which is phasing. If the Biden team wants to go back, and if Iran is happy to kind of use and abuse the Trump legacy to say, well, you can go back, give us sanctions relief, then who goes first? It raises that question, and that question is unsolved at the moment. And if Iran says no to whatever the Biden team's first offer is, no matter if it's premature sanctions relief, if it's an IMF loan, if it's some other kind of signal, it's unclear what the Biden team will say if Iran says no to that initial offer. So there's still a lot of, to borrow a phrase, unknown unknowns, which raise the challenges. And lest we forget, there's going to be a domestic election in Iran in about 5-6 months that will make it even harder to come back. But I think because the Iranian economy is hurting, they will have to engage at some point. The question is over the nature of the engagement.
That's what I was going to ask you about. I asked you this question before, if the Trump administration has put the Biden administration in at somewhat of an advantage when it comes to negotiating, because the sanctions have been so crippling that something has to give. And then sort of part two of that is, what sort of changes should the Biden administration insist upon before moving forward?
You know, one of the interesting things about the Trump era is that it got the Europeans, who, lest we forget, this deal is not just between America and Iran. There's Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese. It got the Europeans to move, at least rhetorically, on this position from saying that the deal is the best thing since sliced bread to saying that the deal has deficiencies. And three key deficiencies that were identified before were ballistic missiles, or a potential delivery vehicle for a nuclear weapon, inspections, the quality and quantity of those inspections, and, of course, the sunset clauses, meaning when some of the restrictions in the deal phase out. There needs to be a rewrite of the deal, at least on these three parameters. In my view, once there is an agreement on those three parameters, it should be broadened to include non-nuclear issues, because lest we forget, countries at the region, U.S. partners and allies are at the forefront of the Iran threat. They have more than just nuclear qualms with Iran. So in order to stem the chances of conflict, you want to broaden the scope of the agreements.
Since the U.S. left the deal in 2018, President Trump helped to broker the Abraham Accords agreement between the U.S., Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, which Iran strongly condemned. In a video message congratulating Biden on his inauguration, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu mentioned Iran. I want to play a little of that.
President Biden, you and I have had a warm personal friendship going back many decades. I look forward to working with you to further strengthen the U.S.-Israel alliance, to continue expanding peace between Israel and the Arab world, and to confront common challenges, chief among them the threat posed by Iran.
So we all know that Benjamin Netanyahu had a personal and warm relationship with Donald Trump. He mentions the relationship that he has shared with Biden as well. What impact does Israel have here?
Well, I would say it has an outsized impact because, again, it's one of those countries on the front lines of the expanding Iran threat. There's deep political, military intelligence cooperation between the U.S. and Israel. But in the region next to Israel, lest we forget, there's been a sea change in the past decade. And even though you said it was, President Trump and the Abraham Accords, the real engine behind those was not U.S. diplomacy, in my view. It was the rising threat from Iran that got the Arabs and Israelis to put aside much of their differences, particularly the Arabs in the Persian Gulf, which have had a different view of Iran and, of course, a different view of Israel. So I think the Prime Minister is right. Washington should be encouraging this wave of normalization to continue. It can help tighten the political and economic kind of containment of the Islamic Republic, literally and physically, in the area. And, of course, it's a great sign of U.S. diplomacy, because if you can get some of these countries to abandon some of their historic no's and long-standing stances against U.S. partners, there's more room for cooperation there. And lest we forget, on the non-nuclear file, in places like Syria, for instance, Israel has been the one doing a military pushback of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the interesting thing for Iran watchers to note is that military pushback, that slight military confrontation, hasn't led to World War III.
Listen, before I let you go, in one of your answers, you mentioned something else. You mentioned Iran is heading into an election. What is the sort of feeling amongst just regular Iranians about this election, about the relationship that Iran has had with the United States? How could this election impact things?
Well, there is this broad observation that a lot of people are able to point to, but it's difficult to cite, which is that Iran is the least anti-American country in the region outside of Israel, despite having one of the most anti-American governments in the country. And in the past 3.5 years of peak U.S. sanctions, Iranians continue to protest en masse, pointing a finger at their own government for the failing political and economic and security situation rather than the U.S. So I think this is an important sign. The Biden administration, once they engage with the Islamic Republic, should not forget about the plight of the Iranian people. The last elections in February 2020 for the parliament were the lowest ever historical turnout in the Islamic Republic since 1979. This point should be taken by the Biden team, that no matter what happens on the nuclear file, domestically the regime is losing legitimacy and the gap between state and society is growing.